The distress signal came from nowhere and everywhere at once through the dark space around the exploration ship Wanderer in the year 2347, and Lieutenant Marcus Cole stood at his station watching the screens with growing concern because something about this signal felt wrong in ways he could not explain to his captain or crew. Captain Lisa Monroe ordered the ship closer to investigate, and Marcus prepared the boarding team with 3 other crew members while the Wanderer approached a damaged vessel that looked like nothing humanity had ever encountered before, with its smooth silver surface that seemed to shift and change colors like oil on water under their scanning lights. The boarding team crossed through the airlock into darkness, and Marcus activated his helmet light to see a corridor that curved in impossible ways, making his head hurt when he tried to follow the walls with his eyes and the air inside read as breathable but cold enough to see his breath despite his suit insulation. They found her in what looked like a medical bay at the center of the ship, inside a stasis pod that glowed with soft blue light, and she was the most alien yet familiar being Marcus had ever seen, with features that reminded him of the old Earth. Legends about elves with pointed ears and silver hair that floated around her face like she was underwater. Around the pod coiled a creature that made Marcus step back in shock because it was a dragon or something so close to the myths that his mind struggled to call it anything else, with scales that flickered between red and black like living fire, and eyes that opened to stare at the boarding team with intelligence that was clearly not animal. The dragon moved but did not attack, and instead seemed to be protecting the woman in the pod, and Marcus made a decision that would change everything by reaching out slowly with his gloved hand toward the creature to show he meant no harm. The dragon watched him for a long moment before it shifted away from the pod just enough to allow access, and Marcus worked quickly with his team to transport both the woman and her companion back to the Wanderer before the damaged ship lost whatever power was keeping it together. Dr. Helen Gray was waiting in the medical bay when they arrived, and she immediately began scanning the alien woman, while the dragon curled protectively in the corner watching every move the humans made with those burning, intelligent eyes that never blinked. The woman woke suddenly with a gasp, and her eyes snapped open, showing pupils that were vertical like a cat, and she spoke in a language that sounded like music and water and wind all at once, until the translator device finally caught enough patterns to begin converting her words. She was defensive and tried to leave the medical bed, but her body was too weak, and she fell back against the pillows while the dragon made a sound that was part growl and part song that somehow conveyed concern without words. Marcus stayed back, but he found himself staring at her because through the tears in her strange clothing he could see markings on her back that glowed with soft silver light, and they looked like writing but also like scars, and they covered her skin from her shoulders down to where her clothing hid the rest. The woman noticed his staring, and her eyes locked onto his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed and small, and she spoke clearly through the translator with a voice that carried both exhaustion and challenge. When she asked, "Why do you keep staring at my back, human?" Marcus tried to explain that he meant no disrespect but was curious about the markings, and the woman laughed, but it was not a happy sound, and she sat up slowly with obvious pain showing on her face. She told him her name was Erin, and she came from a species called the Ilari, who once guarded the edge of the galaxy from threats that came from beyond the known dimensions, and the markings on her back were not decorations or art, but a war ledger that recorded every world she had sworn to protect. Each symbol represented a world, and each glowing mark was one she had failed to save from something she called the Silence, and Marcus felt his blood run cold when she explained that the Silence was not an empire or army but a consuming void that erased everything it touched, as if those places had never existed at all. Erin said she was the last of her kind because all other Ilari had died holding back the Silence, while she was sent away to find allies who could help stop what could not be stopped by her people alone, and she had been drifting in stasis for longer than she knew because time moved strangely near the Silence. The dragon was not a pet, but her bonded companion named Ember, who was born from the same energy that gave the Ilari their power, and he was both guardian and friend and the only other survivor of her dead civilization. Captain Monroe entered the medical bay then and listened to Aaron speak about the threat, and Marcus saw his captain face go pale when Aaron revealed the worst news of all, which was that the silence had followed her path through space and it would reach Earth in approximately 3 months. Aaron stood despite her weakness and turned her back to them, fully showing the hundreds of glowing marks that covered her skin, like a map of tragedy, and she said that each mark burned into her flesh when a world fell and the pain never fully faded because she was meant to carry the memory of every failure, until she either stopped the silence or joined her people in death. Marcus understood then why she carried herself with such weight and why her eyes looked ancient despite her appearance, and he realized that this alien woman was not asking for help but offering one last chance to prevent Earth from becoming another glowing mark on someone else's back if anyone survived to carry the memory forward. The captain immediately ordered a message sent to Earth Command while Dr. Gray tried to make Aaron rest, but the alien woman refused and instead asked to see star charts to confirm her position and calculate how much time they really had before the silence arrived. Ember moved to Aaron's side and pressed his scaled head against her hand, and Marcus saw the bond between them was deeper than words, as if they shared thoughts and feelings across an invisible connection that humans did not possess. Aaron studied the star charts for several minutes before she looked up with eyes that held both determination and deep sorrow, and she confirmed that Earth had 3 months at most before the silence reached their system and consumed everything humans had ever built or loved or dreamed. Marcus asked what they could do against something that erased matter and energy and even space itself, and Aaron smiled sadly and said that was why she needed allies, because the Ilari had discovered one weapon that could hurt the silence, but it required sacrifice on a scale that her dying people could not provide alone. She would teach humanity to fight the unfightable, but first they needed to understand what they were facing, and she asked permission to show them through a memory projection that would let them see what she had witnessed when the silence consumed her homeworld. Captain Monroe agreed, and Aaron touched her hand to the wall while Ember breathed a stream of fire that did not burn but instead created images in the air, showing a beautiful world with towers of crystal and forests of silver trees and people who looked like Aaron moving through cities that seemed built from light itself. Then the silence came, and it was not black or dark, but rather an absence of everything, and where it touched the world simply stopped existing, and the images showed Ilari warriors trying to fight with weapons of light and fire, but nothing worked. And the world was unmade piece by piece until nothing remained but empty space that hurt to look at. The projection ended, and Aaron swayed on her feet, but Ember caught her, and Marcus felt tears on his face because he had just witnessed genocide on a scale that his mind struggled to process. Captain Monroe's voice was steady when she said they would take Aaron to Earth and present her case to the Defense Command, and Marcus knew that humanity was about to face its greatest test, and their only guide was a broken warrior carrying the ghosts of worlds on her back. Dr. Helen Gray had studied alien biology for 15 years, but nothing prepared her for what she discovered when she examined Aaron markings more closely with advanced scanning equipment that could see down to the cellular level and beyond. The marks were alive in a way that defied human understanding because they existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human science barely acknowledged, and they pulsed with energy that matched Aaron's heartbeat and breathing, as if they were organs rather than tattoos. Aaron sat patiently while Helen worked and explained that each marking was created through a binding ritual where an Ilari warrior would swear an oath to protect a specific world, and the oath became part of their physical body, linking them to that place across any distance. When a world fell to the silence, the binding broke violently and burned a permanent scar into the warrior flesh, and the pain was meant to be unbearable so that no Ilari would ever forget what they lost or take their duty lightly. Helen asked if the marks could be removed, and Aaron laughed bitterly and said that removing them would kill her because they were woven into her life force, and removing one would be like removing a piece of her soul. Marcus stood in the medical bay watching the examination, and he noticed that some marks glowed brighter than others, and when he asked about this, Aaron fell silent for a long moment before explaining that the brightest marks were the worlds that died most recently, and they would fade slowly over centuries until they became dim scars. She had marks that were thousands of years old and marks that were only months old, and the newest one near her shoulder blade still caused her visible pain when Helen's scanning equipment passed over it. Captain Monroe called a meeting in the conference room with the senior staff, and Aaron attended with Ember walking beside her, and the dragon was large enough that he barely fit through the doorways, but he moved with surprising grace for something so massive. Aaron stood before the assembled crew and began telling them the history of the Ilari, and how her people had evolved on a world near the galactic rim where the barriers between dimensions were thinnest, and they developed abilities to sense and manipulate the fabric of reality itself. The Ilari became guardians by choice when they discovered that things existed beyond their dimension, and some of those things were hungry, and the silence was the worst of all because it was not truly alive, but rather the echo of a dead universe that sought to consume everything in this one. Her people fought the silence for 10,000 years, holding it back at the edges of known space and protecting younger civilizations, who never knew how close they came to being erased from existence. But the Ilari made a fatal mistake because they believed themselves superior to other species and chose isolation over cooperation, and when the silence evolved and grew stronger, they had no allies to call upon. Erin's voice broke when she described the final battle where every remaining Ilari warrior stood together to buy time for her escape, and she was chosen because she was young and strong, and carried fewer marks than the elders who were weighted down with centuries of scars. They sent her away to find help, and she put herself in stasis, hoping to reach distant civilizations, but the silence damaged her ship, and she drifted for far longer than intended. And now her people were gone, and she was alone except for Ember. The dragon made a soft sound and pressed against Erin's leg in comfort, and Marcus saw tears sliding down her face, but she did not stop speaking. She explained that the silence moved slowly compared to ships, traveling at light speed, but it never stopped and never rested, and it consumed dimensions in a specific pattern that Erin had mapped over her long life. Earth was directly in its path, and there was no way to move a planet or hide from something that existed partially outside normal space, and the only option was to fight. But fighting the silence required weapons that humans did not possess because it could not be hurt by normal matter or energy, and the only thing that affected it was resonance, which meant using sound and light and even emotion in specific patterns that disrupted its existence. The Ilari had developed resonance technology over thousands of years, but they never perfected it. And Erin believed that combining human innovation with Ilari knowledge might create something new that could actually stop the silence instead of just slowing it down. One of the crew members asked why the silence consumed worlds, and Erin said that question haunted her because the silence did not seem to gain anything from destruction, and the best theory was that it was trying to make this universe match the dead one it came from. Helen asked about Ember and how a dragon fit into all this, and Erin smiled for the first time since waking and explained that Ember was not a biological creature, but rather a manifestation of pure Ilari energy given form and consciousness. Every Ilari warrior bonded with an energy guardian when they came of age, and the guardian took whatever form resonated most strongly with the warrior soul, and Erin had always dreamed of dragons from the stories her people collected from other civilizations. Ember could generate barriers that the silence could not immediately break, and he could fly through space without a ship, and most importantly, he could anchor Erin to reality when she had to venture close to the silence to study it. The meeting lasted for hours, and by the end, Captain Monroe had sent multiple messages to Earth Command with all the data they collected, and Erin warning about the approaching threat. Marcus volunteered to be Erin's primary liaison with the human crew because he felt drawn to her in ways he did not fully understand, and she accepted his help with a tired nod. Over the following weeks during the journey back to Earth, Marcus spent hours with Erin learning about the Ilari and the silence, and he began to understand the crushing weight she carried. She showed him memories of worlds she had protected successfully, and they were beautiful beyond description, with civilizations that had art and music and love and all the things that made life worth living. Then she showed him those same worlds after the silence passed through and there was nothing left. but empty space that made his eyes water and his head ache because human brains were not meant to perceive true nothingness. Erin admitted that she sometimes wished she had died with her people because living with the Marks was a special kind of torture, and every time she closed her eyes she heard the screams of billions of beings she could not save. Marcus told her that her survival meant something and that Earth would not make the same mistakes the Alari made by standing alone, and she looked at him with those ancient eyes and said she hoped he was right because she did not think she could bear adding another mark to her back. Ember seemed to understand human emotions better than expected, and he often rested his head in Marcus' lap when they talked, and the dragon warmth was comforting in a way that reminded Marcus of sitting by a fireplace during winter. Helen discovered that Erin marks could be used as a database because each one contained stored memories and information about the world it represented, and this meant Erin carried knowledge about hundreds of civilizations in her own flesh. This discovery gave Earth scientists hope because if they could access those memories, they might find clues about how to fight the silence from civilizations that had tried different approaches. Erin agreed to let them study the marks more deeply, but warned that accessing the memories was painful for her and could only be done in short sessions. The Wanderer finally reached Earth, and Marcus stood beside Erin as they looked at the blue and green world through the observation window, and she stared at it for a long time before speaking. She said Earth was beautiful in a way that reminded her of her own lost homeworld, and she made a silent oath that this world would not fall, and this time she would not fail. Marcus saw her back through her thin clothing, and he noticed that space remained between the marks, as if waiting for new ones to be added, and he realized with horror that she expected to fail again and was preparing herself for another burning scar. He touched her shoulder gently and told her that this time would be different because humans were stubborn and refused to accept defeat, and she smiled sadly and said she hoped human stubborn would be enough because hope was all they had left. Admiral Kate Brennan stood in the command center of Earth Defense watching the alien woman and her dragon with barely concealed suspicion because she had spent 30 years protecting humanity from threats, and trusting strangers did not come easily to someone in her position. Erin presented her evidence to a council of military leaders and scientists, showing them projections of the silence and data collected from hundreds of encounters over thousands of years, and the room fell into shocked silence when they understood what was coming. The Admiral asked hard questions about why they should believe someone who admitted her own people failed, and Erin did not flinch when she answered that disbelief would not stop the silence, and Earth could choose to fight with knowledge or die in ignorance. Marcus watched the tension in the room and spoke up to defend Erin, pointing out that she had nothing to gain by lying and everything to lose by being here instead of running to the far edges of the galaxy to extend her survival. Admiral Brennan studied Erin for a long moment before nodding and saying that Earth would prepare for war, but they needed proof that resonance weapons could actually work against this threat. Erin agreed and said she would need volunteers to undergo training that would be dangerous and painful because humans did not naturally perceive the dimensions where resonance worked, and forcing that perception required changing how their brains processed reality. A young pilot named Amy Foster stepped forward immediately and volunteered, because she had read all the reports and understood that someone had to be first, and she would rather die trying than wait for the silence to arrive. The training began in a facility built specifically to house Erin work, and she explained that resonance was about matching frequencies with the target, and the silence vibrated at frequencies that existed between dimensions. Amy had to learn to sense these frequencies, which required Ember help, because the dragon could generate fields that made the invisible visible and allowed human minds to perceive what should be impossible. The first session lasted only minutes before Amy collapsed screaming because her brain could not process what she was experiencing, and Dr. Helen Gray rushed in to stabilize her while Erin watched with guilt written across her face. Marcus confronted Erin that night asking if she knew this would happen, and she admitted that yes, she knew because Alari children underwent similar training, and many did not survive the process, but there was no other way to fight the silence. He was angry at first, but then he saw the marks on her back glowing brighter as if responding to her distress, and he understood that she hated causing pain, but saw no alternative. Amy recovered and insisted on continuing the training despite the risks, and over the following weeks she slowly adapted until she could sense the resonance frequencies without losing consciousness. Other volunteers joined the program, and a few succeeded while others had to stop when their minds could not handle the strain, and Aaron mourned each failure as if it was another world lost. Meanwhile, Earth scientists worked frantically to retrofit warships with resonance generators based on Ilari designs, and the technology was bizarre because it required crystals that had to be grown in zero gravity while exposed to specific sound frequencies. Admiral Brennan began to trust Aaron more when she saw the alien woman working 18-hour days without rest to help prepare Earth defenses and never asking for anything in return except basic food and shelter. Marcus noticed that Aaron Marks seemed to be fading slowly, and when he asked about it, she explained that being around so many people who were fighting to survive was healing in a way, because it reminded her that life was worth protecting. Ember bonded with Amy during her training, and the dragon seemed to recognize her courage and determination, and he often curled around her during rest periods, providing warmth and comfort that helped her recover faster. A probe was sent toward the Silence location to gather more data, and when it returned, the footage showed something that made even the most hardened military officers feel fear. The Silence looked like a wall of nothing that stretched across space, and where it touched reality simply stopped existing, and stars disappeared, and even light seemed to be erased as if it never was. Aaron watched the footage with Marcus, and she told him that what they were seeing was only the edge, and the true horror was what lay beyond, because the Silence was not empty space but rather filled with the compressed remains of everything it had consumed. She had once ventured close enough to sense the screaming of dead worlds echoing in frequencies that human equipment could not detect, and the experience had given her nightmares for decades. Marcus asked why she kept fighting after witnessing such horror, and she was quiet for a long time before answering that giving up would mean all the marks on her back were for nothing, and she refused to let the memory of those worlds die with her. Admiral Brennan called another meeting after 2 months of preparation, and she announced that Earth would establish a defensive line at the edge of the solar system where the fleet would make their stand. Aaron argued that they should evacuate civilians from Earth in case the defense failed, but the Admiral said there was nowhere to evacuate to because the Silence moved faster than colony ships and would catch any refugees. The only choice was to win or die, and Aaron accepted this with the same tired resignation that Marcus had come to recognize. And he wondered how many times she had faced impossible odds before. Amy completed her training and became the first human to successfully fire a resonance weapon that created a visible disruption in the dimensional fabric, and Aaron actually smiled when she saw the results. More pilots trained and more ships were equipped, and Earth mobilized its entire defense fleet, knowing this would be the biggest battle humanity had ever fought. Aaron spent her nights studying star charts and trying to find any weakness in the Silence pattern of movement, but she found nothing because it did not think or plan and simply consumed everything in its path. Marcus found her one night staring at her reflection in a window and tracing the marks on her back with her fingers, and she told him that she was preparing herself for the pain of another mark. He grabbed her hand and said that Earth would not fall and she would not carry another scar, and she looked at him with something like hope in her ancient eyes. The day before the fleet launched, Aaron performed a ritual that Marcus did not fully understand, where she and Ember created a bond with the human volunteers, linking them to the resonance network. Amy described it as feeling like her mind expanded to touch something vast and beautiful and terrible, and she understood for the first time what the Ilari had carried for thousands of years. Admiral Brennan gave a speech to the assembled forces, talking about how humanity had always faced impossible odds and always found a way to survive, and this time would be no different. Aaron stood beside the Admiral, and she spoke briefly, saying that the Ilari had failed because they fought alone, but humanity would succeed because they fought together, and she was honored to stand with them. The fleet launched toward the edge of the solar system, and Marcus served on the Wanderer, which was now heavily modified with resonance weapons and reinforced shields. Aaron and Ember traveled on the flagship with Admiral Brennan, and the plan was for them to coordinate the resonance network during the battle. As the fleet traveled toward the defensive line, Marcus thought about everything they had learned and everything they were risking, and he wondered if they were truly ready to face something that had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than humanity. But then he remembered Aaron's words about stubborn hope, and he decided that maybe being stubborn was exactly what they needed, because the Silence had never encountered a species quite like humans before. The fleet reached the threshold as they named the defensive line, and they began detecting the Silence on long-range sensors, and it was arriving ahead of schedule, which meant they had less time to prepare than expected. Erin confirmed the readings, and her face went pale because the Silence was moving faster than it ever had in her recorded history, and she realized it must have learned from previous encounters and was adapting. Admiral Brennan ordered all ships to battle stations, and the greatest fight for Earth survival was about to begin. Commander Ben Shaw led the Vanguard fleet at the front line, and he was the first to see the Silence arrive in real time, and he immediately understood why. Erin had looked so haunted when she described it because no words could capture the wrongness of what approached. It was not darkness or shadow, but rather the complete absence of everything, and where it touched space, the stars simply ceased to exist, and looking at it too long made crew members report headaches and nausea, and 2 people had to be sedated after staring at it directly. The human fleet opened fire with conventional weapons first to test the effect, and missiles and energy beams struck the wall of nothing and simply vanished as if they never existed, and no explosions occurred because there was nothing to explode against. Admiral Brennan gave the order to activate resonance weapons, and across the fleet crystals began vibrating at frequencies that made the ships themselves like musical instruments, and beams of distorted light shot toward the Silence. When the resonance beams hit their target, something amazing happened, because the Silence reacted and pulled back slightly, and visible cracks appeared in the wall of nothing, showing that it could be hurt. Erin's voice came over the fleet communications, directing the ships to focus fire on the cracks to widen them and prevent the Silence from healing the damage. The human forces coordinated their attack, and for the first time in recorded history, the Silence advance stopped completely, and Marcus felt hope surge through him as he watched from the Wanderer tactical station. But then the Silence adapted, because it was not stupid and had learned from consuming civilizations that fought back, and the wall began shifting its frequency to absorb the resonance beams instead of being damaged by them. Erin cursed in her own language and quickly recalculated new frequency patterns and transmitted them to Amy and the other trained pilots, who adjusted their weapons and fired again. The new frequencies worked, but only for minutes before the Silence adapted again, and Erin realized with growing horror that they were in an arms race. They could not win because the Silence learned faster than they could innovate. Ships began disappearing from the Vanguard as the Silence pushed forward again, and when Marcus checked the sensors, he saw that the ships were not destroyed but rather unmade, and even the debris ceased to exist. Commander Ben Shaw's ship was caught at the edge of the Silence, and his final transmission was cut off mid-word, as if he simply stopped being, and Marcus felt sick knowing that a good man had just been erased from reality. The fleet pulled back too. The second defensive line and Admiral Brennan demanded options from Erin, who stood on the flagship bridge with her hands shaking because she had seen this pattern before on dozens of worlds. Erin finally spoke, and her voice was flat when she revealed the terrible truth that there was only one way to truly hurt the Silence, and that was to detonate a resonance bomb from inside it where the dimensional barriers were weakest. The problem was that going inside the Silence meant certain death, because nothing could survive in that void, and whoever carried the bomb would be erased along with it. Marcus heard this over the communication channel, and he immediately understood what Erin was planning, because the marks on her back had started glowing brighter, and she was preparing to add one final mark for Earth. He also understood that she never expected to survive this battle and had been preparing for this sacrifice since the moment she arrived. Amy's voice cut through the channel, saying she would carry the bomb because she was trained in resonance and could navigate close to the Silence, but Erin refused and said only someone bonded to an energy guardian could survive long enough to reach the detonation point. Admiral Brennan ordered her to find another way, but Erin shook her head and said there was no other way, and this was what she was meant to do and why she survived when her people died. Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself, and he abandoned his post on the Wanderer and took a shuttle to the flagship without permission because he was not going to let Erin die alone. He arrived on the bridge and confronted her directly, saying that she taught them about bonds and connections, and if she was going into the silence, then he and Amy were going with her to serve as anchors. Erin started to argue, but Ember moved between them and made a sound that was half roar and half song, and Marcus somehow understood that the dragon was agreeing with him. Amy arrived moments later, having followed Marcus' lead, and she stood beside him and told Erin that humans were stubborn and did not abandon their allies, and Erin was their ally now, whether she liked it or not. Admiral Brennan watched this exchange and then shocked everyone by supporting the plan because she recognized that three minds linked together might be able to do what one could not. Erin finally agreed, but only after making Marcus and Amy understand that this would hurt in ways they could not imagine, and they might not survive. Even if the plan worked, they had 30 minutes to prepare while the fleet continued fighting and losing ground, and Marcus used that time to record a message for his family explaining what he was about to do and why it mattered. Erin performed a bonding ritual with Marcus and Amy where ember fire connected all three of them, and Marcus felt his mind expand to touch both the alien woman thoughts and Amy consciousness. Through the bond, he experienced Erin memories and felt the weight of every mark on her back and understood the depth of her grief and determination, and he also felt her fear that she would fail again. Amy's thoughts were bright with courage and determination, and Marcus realized that humans brought something to this bond that Ilari did not have, which was the ability to hope even when all evidence suggested hopelessness. The three of them plus Ember boarded a small ship carrying the resonance bomb, and they flew toward the silence, while the fleet provided covering fire to keep a path open. As they approached the wall of nothing, Marcus felt his mind start to fracture because human brains were not meant to perceive true void. But the bond with Erin and Amy kept him anchored to reality. They crossed the threshold into the silence, and everything went wrong because the ship instruments failed immediately, and Marcus could not tell if his eyes were open or closed. Erin guided them deeper using senses that humans did not possess, and Marcus held on to the bond with everything he had because letting go meant being erased. Inside the silence, they encountered something unexpected because it had consciousness, and that consciousness recognized Erin and remembered her from previous encounters. The silence was not evil, but endlessly hungry because it was the echo of a dead universe trying to make this universe match what it lost, and it did not understand that consumption was not creation. Erin reached the detonation point and prepared to trigger the bomb, but Marcus felt her hesitation through the bond because she realized that destroying the silence might also destroy the memories of everything it had consumed. Those memories were all that remained of countless civilizations, and Erin could not bear to erase them completely, even to save Earth. Marcus understood her conflict, and through the bond he shared an idea that came from human philosophy about transformation instead of destruction. What if instead of killing the silence they changed it by showing it what it meant to exist in connection rather than isolation? Amy added her own thoughts about how humans believe that even broken things could be healed and remade into something new. Together, the three of them channeled their combined consciousness through ember fire, and instead of detonating the bomb, they used it as a beacon to flood the silence with memories of living. Marcus shared memories of his childhood and family and all the small, beautiful moments that made life worth living. Amy shared memories of flying and the joy of mastering difficult skills and the pride of standing with people she respected. Erin opened the marks on her back and shared not just the pain of loss, but also the beauty of what those worlds had been before they fell. The silence consciousness recoiled from this flood of life and memory because it had never experienced anything except hunger and consumption for a moment. Marcus thought they had failed because the silence pushed back hard enough to start erasing Ember, who was their anchor to reality. But then something miraculous happened because the silence stopped pushing and instead began pulling the memories toward itself as if it was thirsty for what they offered. The resonance bomb activated, but instead of destroying it, transformed, and the silence began changing from a void that erased everything to something new that Marcus did not have words to describe. The three of them were pulled violently back toward normal space, and Marcus lost consciousness, but not before feeling Aaron relief and shock through the bond because they had survived something that should have killed them. He woke on the flagship medical bay with Amy in the bed next to him and Aaron standing by the window looking out at space where the silence had been. Admiral Brennan entered and reported that the silence had retreated and was no longer consuming but instead seemed to be dormant or perhaps transformed into something that was neither alive nor dead. The battle was over and Earth was saved, but Marcus knew the cost had been high because they lost hundreds of ships and thousands of crew members who were erased before the transformation occurred. Aaron turned from the window and Marcus saw that her back was visible. 6 months after the battle at the threshold, Marcus stood in the memorial garden that Earth had built to honor those who were lost, and he watched Aaron placed flowers at the base of the monument that listed names of crew members who had been erased. The flowers were from her homeworld, or rather seeds she had carried in stasis for thousands of years, and they bloomed in colors that Earth had never seen before, with petals that seemed to glow softly even in daylight. Dr. Helen Gray had spent months studying what happened to Aaron after the transformation, and she discovered that the marks on her back had fundamentally changed because they were no longer just scars of failure. The silver marks representing lost worlds remained, but they now glowed with gentle light instead of painful burning and new gold. Marks had appeared representing worlds that were saved, including Earth, which held a prominent place near her left shoulder. Aaron explained that the transformation of the silence had somehow healed part of her because showing it memories of beauty had reminded her that failure was not the end of meaning and that even loss could be honored without being consumed by it. The silence itself had retreated to the space between galaxies, and it no longer consumed, but instead seemed to exist in a state that scientists called dimensional hibernation, where it was neither fully present nor absent, probes sent to observe. It reported strange readings that suggested the silence was processing the memories it had absorbed, and perhaps learning what it meant to exist without destroying. Marcus had changed too because the bond with Aaron and Amy remained even after the battle, and he could sometimes feel their emotions across vast distances and sense when they needed support. Amy had become something between human and Ilari because the extensive training and the bond had permanently altered how her brain processed reality, and she could now sense dimensional frequencies without Ember help. She led a new program training other humans in resonance techniques, and her methods were gentler than Aaron's original approach because she understood human limitations better. Ember had transformed most dramatically because during the battle inside the silence he had absorbed fragments of the void, and now he carried darkness within his fire and served as a guardian against any future dimensional threats. The dragon was larger than before, and his scales shifted between red fire and black void, creating patterns that were both beautiful and unsettling to watch. Aaron had chosen to stay on Earth rather than search for any surviving Ilari who might have escaped the genocide, and when Marcus asked why she touched the gold mark representing Earth, she said that among humans she found something her people had lost, which was the understanding that strength came from connection rather than isolation, and that accepting help was not weakness. The battle had revealed dozens of other civilizations that had been hiding throughout the galaxy, waiting for the silence to pass, and now with the threat transformed, they began reaching out to make contact. Earth became a hub for interspecies cooperation because humanity had proven they could face impossible odds and find solutions through creativity and stubborn determination. Admiral Brennan retired from military service and became Earth ambassador to the newly forming Galactic Council, and she brought Aaron with her as an advisor because the alien woman knowledge was invaluable. Marcus remained in service but transferred to diplomatic corps because his bond with Aaron made him uniquely qualified to work with alien species and understand their perspectives. He spent his days helping negotiate treaties and establish communication protocols, and his nights were often spent with Aaron discussing the future they were building together. The bond between them had grown into something neither of them expected because it started as necessity during battle but became genuine friendship and perhaps something deeper. Aaron was teaching human children about the stars and the civilizations that existed beyond Earth, and Marcus sometimes watched her interact with the kids and saw how her ancient eyes softened when they asked innocent questions. She no longer carried herself with the crushing weight of failure, and while the marks on her back remained, they were now sources of strength rather than shame. One evening, Marcus found Erin standing on a hill watching the sunset, and he noticed that her back was uncovered because she no longer felt the need to hide the marks. He asked if she was happy, and she considered the question for a long time before answering that happy was not quite the right word, but she felt something like peace. She explained that for thousands of years, she had defined herself by what she lost and what she failed to protect, and the marks had been constant reminders of inadequacy. But the battle and the transformation showed her that memory could honor the dead without being consumed by grief, and that moving forward did not mean forgetting. The gold marks were new additions to her war ledger, but they represented a different kind of oath, which was not just to protect, but to connect and build and create. Earthmark glowed brightest among the gold ones, and she said it would always hold special meaning because humanity taught her that failure was not final and that even the most broken things could be remade. Marcus asked about the space between marks on her back where skin remained unmarked, and Aaron smiled and said those spaces were for future worlds that would need protection. She was no longer the last Ilari because humans had learned resonance techniques and formed bonds with dimensional guardians, and in a way, they were becoming a new generation of guardians. Amy arrived with Ember flying beside her, and she had news about a distress signal from a distant system where a young civilization was facing a natural disaster. Aaron immediately volunteered to help, and Marcus and Amy agreed to go with her because they worked best as a team. As they prepared to leave Earth, Aaron performed a small ritual where she created a new mark on her back representing the civilization they were going to help. But this mark was different because she created it before the mission rather than after failure, and it glowed gold from the start, representing hope rather than loss. Marcus understood that Aaron was reclaiming her war ledger and transforming it from a record of failure into a chronicle of purpose and connection. They boarded a ship equipped with both human technology and Ilari knowledge, and Ember flew alongside them through space. Helen Gray stayed behind to continue her research, but she made Aaron promise to return safely because Earth needed her wisdom and guidance. Admiral Brennan gave them her blessing and reminded them that they were not just representing Earth, but all species who believed in cooperation over isolation during the journey. Marcus asked Aaron if she missed her homeworld and her people, and she was honest when she said yes, she missed them every day. But she also said that grief was something to carry rather than something to be buried, and that honoring the dead meant living fully rather than merely surviving. The marks on her back would always represent loss because you could not save everyone and some battles could not be won. But now they also represented connection and hope, and the stubborn human belief that trying mattered even when success was not guaranteed. Amy practiced her resonance techniques during the flight, and Ember helped her reach new levels of perception that even Aaron found impressive. When they arrived at the endangered civilization, they found a people who reminded Marcus of humanity before space travel, with hope and fear and determination all mixed together. Aaron spoke to their leaders through translation devices and offered help without demanding anything in return because that was what Guardians did. Together with Amy and Marcus and the local people, they worked to divert the natural disaster and save millions of lives. When the work was done and they prepared to leave, Aaron touched her back where the new mark glowed, and she felt warmth instead of burning. The local people wanted to thank them, but Aaron simply said that life was worth protecting and they should remember to reach out to others. When they developed space travel on the journey back to Earth, Marcus noticed that Aaron smiled more often and her ancient eyes held less sorrow. She caught him watching her and asked the same question she had asked when they first met about why he kept staring at her back. But this time, Marcus answered differently and said he was watching her marks shine like stars and remembering that even darkness could be transformed into light. Erin laughed, and it was a genuine sound of joy rather than bitterness, and she said that humans had a gift for seeing beauty in broken things. Ember flew loops around their ship in what appeared to be dragon celebration, and Amy joined in using her new abilities to create patterns of light that danced through space. Marcus realized that they had become something unique in the galaxy, which was a team of humans and Ilari and Dragon working together to protect life. When they returned to Earth, there was a crowd waiting to welcome them home, and Marcus saw children in the crowd looking up at Erin with wonder. She knelt down to speak with them and showed them her marks, explaining that each one told a story, and that stories were how people remembered what mattered. The children asked if they could become guardians too, and Erin told them that being a guardian meant choosing to care about others even when it was hard. Marcus stood beside her and felt the bond connecting him to both Erin and Amy, and through them to something larger, which was the growing network of beings who refused to let darkness win.